A sleek new FPGA gaming device is now available, and it allows you to play your Nintendo 64 games in 4K. This is the long-awaited Analogue 3D. On the outside, it looks great, but as you learned early in life, you can't judge a book by its cover. So today, we're going to pop the hood and take a look at how it works. Analogue is at it again, this time with what seems to be their most powerful device to date, the Analogue 3D. In a previous video, I took an in-depth look at the Analogue Pocket, and I was rather impressed with its design. From a hardware engineering perspective, that device looked great, and I have high hopes for the 3D as well. So in this video, we're going to tear it down and see what's under the hood. But before I do, let's take a look at the overall design of the hardware from an end user's perspective. The Analogue 3D looks like a very sleek take on the Nintendo 64. Personally, I really like the clean design aesthetic. On the front face, we have 4 ports for Nintendo 64 controllers. Situated beneath each port is an LED. This lights up when you connect a wireless controller, indicating which ports are actively used. In the rear of the device, we have an SD card slot. This card stores the data from your cartridge library and your virtual controller pack. Next to the SD card slot, there's an HDMI connector. The Analogue 3D supports upscaled 4K video output, along with a number of different display filters that can simulate various display types. And next to the HDMI port, we have 2 USB ports, which can be used with wired USB controllers. And finally, there's a USB-C port for providing power. The Analogue 3D uses the USB power delivery protocol, so we'll need to take a closer look at how that works when we open it up. On top of the device, we have the power switch on the left side. This is a momentary slide switch, and it feels rather nice. And on the right, we have the reset button. And of course, there's the cartridge slot where you load your Nintendo 64 game pack. Alright, let's pop it open and see what's inside. At first glance, it seems like Analogue doesn't want you to open this thing up, because there's no exposed screws. We do, however, have this rubber pad on the bottom, and that seems to peel off rather easily. Upon removing it, we find some screws underneath. We can remove the screw holding the shielding into place, and then lift this adhesive, allowing the shielding to slide down and lift off. And with the metal shielding off, you can see the bottom of the cartridge connector, as well as a ribbon cable which looks to connect to the front controller panel. To remove the bottom half of the enclosure, we'll need to remove the screw in each of the 4 corners. The cartridge connector is screwed into the top half of the enclosure, so we'll also need to remove the 3 screws that hold it into place. Then we can release the ribbon cable's connector to unclip it. The bottom half of the enclosure is held together with clips along each side. To open it, I used some plastic opening picks and just worked my way around the enclosure. And once loose, the top half of the enclosure can be lifted off, revealing the Analogue 3D's mainboard. Now, there's a lot going on here. I don't have time to go through every single component, but I do want to talk about a few that are rather interesting. But to do that, I first need to remove this massive fan and heatsink. And of course, parked underneath is a huge Cyclone 10 FPGA. Analogue has used Cyclone 10s in other products. You may recall from my Analogue Pocket analysis that there's a small Cyclone 10 functioning as an auxiliary FPGA to drive the LCD and other system functions. But this Cyclone 10 is a lot bigger, and I don't just mean physically. This is a GX series chip, which includes a massive 220,000 logic elements. For comparison, the Analogue Pocket Cyclone 5 only has 49,000 logic elements, and the Cyclone 5 used by the MiSTer project has 110,000 logic elements. So this Cyclone 10 has double the logic elements of a MiSTer. One big difference, however, is that unlike the MiSTer, this FPGA is not an SoC. And that means there's no CPU on the chip's die. So for running Analogue's 3DOS, there's an STM32 microcontroller. Well, 3 actually. You see, there's this larger H5 series MCU, which is a 250 MHz ARM Cortex-M33. And next to it, there's a smaller G0 series MCU, and that's an ARM Cortex-M0 running at 64 MHz. But a bit farther away, there's this other H7 series STM32, and that houses a Cortex-M7 running at 550 MHz. Now, you'll notice that there's some shielding and an antenna near that H7 series microcontroller. So normally I would guess that that's the MCU that's driving the Bluetooth and Wi-Fi stack. However, I'm not sure that's the case here. And I say that because of this chip. This is a 4 MB flash chip, and it's connected to the H5 series MCU, which I verified with my multimeter. I wanted to see what was on this chip, so I wired it up to my TL866 and dumped its contents. And what I found is that there's only about 1 KB of data on this 4 MB chip. And it has the strings BT stack, SMER, and SMIR in the header. Now, taking a closer look at the data, you'll see that there are a number of MAC addresses, and these correspond to the Bluetooth controllers that are paired with the console. So this tells us 2 things. First, the H5 series STM32 is the microcontroller that's interfacing with the Bluetooth stack, not the MCU that's near the antenna. And second, the strings SMER and SMIR are used in the open source Blue Kitchen Bluetooth stack. So that looks to be the Bluetooth implementation that Analogue's using. I also noticed that the H5 connects to this USB port directly next to it. So in addition to Bluetooth, this chip is managing USB controller input as well, at least for this particular port. You see, there's no dedicated USB host controller chip on the Analogue 3D. But this microcontroller actually has a USB host controller built in. However, it only supports one USB device, so it's only controlling this particular port. This other USB port is connected to the smaller G0 series STM32. This chip also has its own USB host controller, and it too only supports one device. So if you were wondering why there's only 2 USB ports on board, well, there's your answer. This G0 series microcontroller also performs another critical task for the system. Looking nearby, we'll find the power section of the board, which is run from a USB-C power supply. Here you'll notice the TCPP chip. This is a USB Type-C port protection device, and its job is to make sure the system doesn't get damaged if the USB-C power source misbehaves. But the TCPP doesn't perform any USB power delivery functionality on its own. Instead, it hands off that job to the STM32. This microcontroller includes a USB PD interface, which the firmware uses to handle the actual PD messaging and negotiate an appropriate voltage with the charger. Once that's done, it signals the port protection chip, which then drives the gate of this MOSFET here, and that connects VBus to the main power rail. So that leaves this other ARM Cortex-M7 MCU over here. Now, I'm not able to confirm this without a schematic, but I suspect that this is the processor that's running Analogue's 3DOS. I think it still might be managing the Wi-Fi because it is physically near the Wi-Fi module, and it would make sense that the chip running the OS is the one that uses the Wi-Fi capabilities. I also want to draw your attention to these two chips over here. These are both 32 megabyte flash chips made by Giga Device. I wanted to find out if the FPGA bitstream is stored in one or both of these chips. So I went ahead and wired them up to my TL866 and dumped their contents as well. Both chips do have different data inside, but since bitstreams don't have a header, I can't say for certain which of these chips it's stored in. I had an idea though. You see, there's no HDMI controller chip on the Analogue 3D. You will find a Texas Instruments TDP-158 redriver sitting behind the HDMI port, but this chip just cleans up and reconditions the signal before it's sent out to the port. If you follow the traces from the redriver, you'll see that the HDMI signals are routing directly from the FPGA. And that makes sense because the FPGA is doing the 4K upscaling and applying all the different display filters. But this also means that video output won't work until the bitstream is sent to the FPGA. So I connected both flash chips to my logic analyzer and captured the SPI traffic when the system boots up. Now you'll notice that after turning the Analogue 3D on, there's a few seconds of delay before you see the Analogue logo on the screen. And sure enough, my capture shows that this is the period that data is being read from these flash chips. The first channel in the capture is the chip select line for the first flash chip, labeled U11. And channel 3 is the chip select line for the second flash chip, U12. Chip select is active low, and you'll notice that U12 stays high the entire time, which keeps it idle. However, the chip select line for U11 is constantly being toggled as data is read from the chip. And when you look at the output line, you'll see that the data on the wire matches up perfectly with the data that I dumped from U11 earlier. So I think we can safely conclude that U11 is where the FPGA bitstream is stored. Moving on, you'll also find 3 different arrays of memory on board. First, there are 2 128 megabyte Alliance DDR3 chips for a total of 256 megabytes of SDRAM. Now, without a schematic, I can only speculate on what this memory is used for, especially since it's in a BGA form factor because I can't physically trace it without depopulating the board. But given the 4K video scaler and the ability to apply display filters, I'm thinking that these chips are probably used for the frame buffer. The second memory chip is this guy right here, another Alliance chip. But this one is only 32 megabytes, and it's low-power SDRAM operating at 166 MHz. Now, the original Nintendo 64 included 4 megabytes of fast serial RDRAM memory, which operated at 250 MHz. So this chip is too slow to emulate that RAM. That leads me to believe that it's probably used for the OS or something else that doesn't require fast memory. And that leaves this last trio of Alliance DDR3 chips, each with 32 megabytes of capacity. These all run at speeds of up to 933 MHz, so they are fast enough to emulate the N64 console memory. So I'm guessing that these chips are used for emulating the N64's RDRAM, but without access to the HDL, this is just speculation. Also near the FPGA, there's a Nexperia bus transceiver. This chip is situated above the cartridge port connector, which we would expect, because it's likely buffering the cartridge pins. Another interesting discovery was this chip, a Realtek ALC5616. This is an audio codec chip, and it seems out of place because the FPGA is likely feeding digital audio directly to the HDMI port. But when I took a closer look at this chip, I noticed that the microphone input pins have traces connected to them. Now, the N64 did have a microphone input module called the Voice Recognition Unit, and the Analogue 3D is compatible with it. But the VRU has its own ADC built in, so that doesn't explain why there's a chip here that supports microphone input. It does make me wonder, though, if Analogue is planning on adding some sort of virtual VRU capability. Or maybe the audio codec is being used for something else that I'm not even thinking of. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Just like the other Analogue products that I've looked at, the engineering behind the Analogue 3D's hardware is solid. I only hope they continue releasing updates that take advantage of it all. I'm impressed to see a large Cyclone 10 GX series FPGA, but I don't think we'll ever be able to use it for running other cores. Since the FPGA runs critical system functionality like video output, I seriously doubt that Analogue will open it up to developers. But at the end of the day, many people are saying this is the best way to play Nintendo 64 games, at least for now. I hope you enjoyed this in-depth look at the hardware design of the Analogue 3D. For more of this type of thing, please consider subscribing. And if you've stuck around this long, I'd also like you to know that I've decided to stand up a Patreon starting in the new year. It's something I've avoided doing for a couple of years now, but it's at the point where I think it's necessary in order to offset some of the production costs of my videos. I'd love to hear what kinds of benefits you'd like to see me provide through that platform. Things like live streams, Q&As, maybe early video access? Leave a comment and let me know what you think. I'd love to hear your suggestions. Alright, well, that's all I have for today, so I'll see you next time. But, as always, until then, go make something cool.